Have you ever had a moment where the ground simply falls away from beneath you, not in a dream, but in the bright, unforgiving light of day, surrounded by strangers? For Jessica Caldwell, that moment came between a sip of lukewarm coffee and the shattering of her 15-year marriage. She was lured into a public trap by the man she loved, designed for one purpose, her complete and utter humiliation at the hands of his mistress. The whispers, the stares, the venomous words. It was a nightmare unfolding in real time. She was cornered and alone, with no way out. But in a quiet corner of that bustling cafe sat one person who knew the truth. A single witness who was about to stand up and bring the entire charade crashing down in a way no one, least of all Jessica's husband, could have ever predicted. Jessica Caldwell believed in the life she had built. From the outside, it was perfect, a meticulously crafted edifice of success and happiness. Their home, a sprawling contemporary masterpiece in the suburbs of Chicago, was featured in an architectural magazine once. It was her husband David's design, of course. David, a senior partner at the prestigious consulting firm Stratton & Cole, was the architect of their entire life. Jessica had been his support, his sounding board, and the quiet force that managed every detail of their world so he could focus on his meteoric rise. 15 years ago, Jessica had been a promising architectural photographer with a keen eye for form and light. She met David at a gallery opening where her work was being shown. He was charming, brilliant, and saw the world in bold, ambitious lines that mirrored her own artistic sensibilities. He'd swept her off her feet with promises of a partnership, a life built together, brick by brick. But slowly, imperceptibly, the partnership had shifted. Her photography equipment began gathering dust in the attic as managing their social calendar, hosting dinner parties for his clients, and ensuring their home was a perfect reflection of his status became her full-time, unpaid job. "Jess, you're the only one I trust to get this right," he would say, his hand on her back, his voice a smooth balm of persuasion. "This dinner for the board is more important than any photo shoot." And she, loving him, had believed it. The cracks, when they began to appear, were hairline fractures easy to ignore. They started as small changes in his routine. The late nights at the office became more frequent, often followed by the faint, unfamiliar scent of a perfume that wasn't hers clinging to his suit jacket. He'd dismiss her questions with a wave of his hand. "Project deadline, honey. It's a killer." Then came the emotional distance. Conversations became transactional, revolving around schedules and finances. His compliments, once poetic and specific, became generic. "You look nice," he'd say, his eyes already on his phone, scrolling through emails. The man who once noticed the slightest change in her haircut now barely seemed to notice she was in the room. Jessica tried to bridge the growing chasm. She'd plan date nights, book weekend getaways, and try to reignite the spark that had once burned so brightly. But it was like trying to start a fire with damp wood. He was present in body, but absent in spirit, his mind perpetually elsewhere. He developed a new cruel habit of turning her concerns back on her. One evening, she confronted him about a credit card bill that showed a charge for a $400 dinner at Spiaggia, a restaurant they hadn't been to together in years. "I saw the charge, David." "Who were you with?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He didn't even look up from his laptop. "It was a client meeting, a new account from Zurich. You know how this works, Jess. We have to wine and dine them." "A client at 10 p.m. on a Saturday." He finally looked at her, his expression a perfect blend of condescension and pity. "Are we really doing this? I'm out there killing myself to provide this life for us, And you're here questioning my expense reports like some kind of forensic accountant? Honestly, this insecurity is becoming exhausting." She flinched as if struck. Insecurity. That was his new favorite word for her. Her valid questions, her gut feelings that something was terribly wrong, were all dismissed as her own emotional failing. He was a master gaslighter, making her feel like she was the one unraveling the one who was paranoid and ungrateful. The fight ended, as they all did, with her apologizing, feeling small and foolish, and him magnanimously forgiving her for her episode. The real alarm bell, the one she couldn't ignore, rang a month later. David was in the shower, and his second phone, his work phone, which was usually glued to his hand, buzzed on the nightstand. Jessica had never invaded his privacy before. It was a line she'd never considered crossing, but a primal, instinctual fear took over. Her hands shook as she picked it up. It was unlocked. A string of messages was on the screen from a name she didn't recognize. Kimberly. Kimberly last night was incredible. Can't stop thinking about you. Kimberly just booked the suite at the Langham for next weekend, like you wanted. My little surprise for you. Can't wait to have you all to myself again. Kimberly. Did you talk to her yet? You promised you would. Soon, David. I can't keep living like this in the shadows. The screen blurred as tears filled Jessica's eyes. It wasn't just the confirmation of the affair. It was the casual intimacy, the shared plans, the chilling finality of that last message. Did you talk to her yet? Her. She wasn't Jessica anymore. She was an obstacle, a problem to be dealt with. The life she believed she was building with David was a lie. The gilded cage she lived in wasn't a home. It was a stage set, and she was the unknowing actress whose part was about to be written out of the script. The cold, hard dread that washed over her was quickly replaced by something else, a slow-burning, clarifying rage. The performance was over. The days that followed the discovery of the text messages were a strange, surreal limbo. Jessica moved through her life with a brittle, apathetic grace, the perfect wife automaton. She made coffee, discussed David's schedule, and smiled at their neighbors, all while a silent scream was trapped in her chest. The knowledge of his betrayal was a physical presence, a cold stone in her stomach. Every word he spoke was now filtered through the lens of his deceit. His "I love you," uttered as he left for work, felt like a slap. She needed more than just text messages. She needed to see it, to understand the scope of the life he was living without her. The part of her that was an artist, the part that observed, that framed the truth through a lens, took over. It wasn't about revenge, not yet. It was about reclaiming her own sanity, about proving to herself that she wasn't the insecure, paranoid woman he'd painted her to be. Her old skills came rushing back. She was methodical. She started with his finances, gaining access to the full online statements for credit cards he thought she never checked. There it was, a shadow life, documented in cold, hard numbers. Weekly lunches at expensive downtown restaurants, charges from lingerie boutiques she had never set foot in, a recurring payment to a luxury apartment complex in the trendy River North neighborhood, an address she didn't recognize. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she typed the address into Google Maps. A sleek, glass and steel high-rise. A love nest. He wasn't just having an affair, he was funding a second life. The next step was harder. She had to know who Kimberly was. A quick search on David's work server, his password was pathetically predictable. The name of his first dog brought up the company directory. She scrolled through the names, her breath catching in her throat. There she was. Kimberly Jennings, a junior marketing associate, barely 26 years old. The photo showed a bright, ambitious-looking young woman with sharp eyes and a practiced smile. She was beautiful in a way that was both generic and intimidating, the kind of woman Jessica saw in magazines, exuding a confident, ruthless energy. The discovery was a fresh stab of pain. It wasn't just a random fling. It was someone within his own world, someone he saw every day. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place a few days later. A friend, Maria, called her, her voice hesitant. "Jess, I don't know how to say this, but I was at lunch in the Loop today, and I saw David. He was with a young blonde woman. They were very close, holding hands across the table. I wouldn't have called, but it looked so serious." Jessica felt a strange sense of calm. "Thank you for telling me, Maria. I appreciate your honesty." There was no shock left, only a grim, weary confirmation. The foundation of her world had crumbled, and she was now standing in the rubble. That night, she decided she would confront him. She waited until he came home, her resolve hardening with every tick of the clock. He walked in around 9 p.m., loosening his tie and sighing dramatically. "You would not believe the day I had. The Peterson account is threatening to walk. My head is splitting." He was setting the stage, preemptively positioning himself as the overworked, stressed-out husband who couldn't possibly handle any emotional drama. Jessica wasn't falling for it anymore. She stood in the center of their cavernous living room, her arms crossed. "We need to talk, David." He tossed his briefcase onto a leather chair. "Can it wait, Jess? I'm really not in the mood." "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm, cutting through his manufactured exhaustion. "It can't. I know about Kimberly Jennings. I know about the apartment in River North. I know about the lunches and the weekends. I know everything." The change in his demeanor was instantaneous. The fatigue vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating stillness. He didn't look guilty or ashamed. He looked annoyed, as if she'd uncovered a logistical problem he now had to solve. "I see," he said, slowly, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "You've been snooping." "I've been waking up," she corrected him. "Tell me, David, how long has this been going on?" He let out a short, humorless laugh. "What does it matter?" "Look, Jess, this is obviously not how I wanted you to find out. Things between us haven't been good for a long time. You have to admit that." There it was again. The shift, the blame, the subtle insinuation that this was somehow her fault, that her unhappiness, or her insecurity, had driven him into the arms of another woman. "Don't you dare put this on me!" she hissed, the rage finally breaking through her composure. "Do not stand there, in the home I made for you, and pretend you are the victim here." He held up his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. Okay, you're upset. I get it. This is messy." He walked over to the bar cart and poured himself a whiskey, his back to her. "I was going to tell you. I've been trying to find the right time." "The right time after you moved her into an apartment you paid for with our money." He turned, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. His eyes were cold. "This is not the place for this conversation. It's too emotional, too charged. We need to be rational adults. Let's meet for brunch on Saturday. We can talk it all through on neutral ground." Calmly. Jessica stared at him, bewildered. Brunch? He wanted to schedule the dissolution of their marriage, like a business meeting. Neutral ground. You want to discuss the end of our life together over eggs, Benedict. "It's better than screaming at each other here," he said smoothly. "The Gilded Spoon. Saturday, noon. We can talk about the future, the arrangements, everything. We can be civilized. For us." A part of her, the logical, conflict-averse part he had cultivated for years, wanted to agree. Maybe a public place would keep him from being cruel. Maybe it would force them into a semblance of civility. But another more primal instinct was screaming that this was a trap. His calmness was unsettling. His quick pivot to a public meeting felt strategic, not conciliatory. But what choice did she have? He refused to discuss it further, retreating behind a wall of detached corporate speak. "Fine," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. "The Gilded Spoon. Saturday." He nodded, satisfied. "Good. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some early calls tomorrow." He finished his whiskey and walked upstairs, not to their bedroom, but to the guest room, shutting the door firmly behind him. Jessica stood alone in the silent house, the architect's masterpiece, feeling the chilling certainty that she was not being invited to a civilized discussion. She was being summoned to an execution. The 2 days leading up to the Saturday brunch were the longest of Jessica's life. The house, once a symbol of her shared success with David, now felt like a mausoleum. Every object held a memory that was now tainted, a relic from a life that was a lie. David remained in the guest room, and their interactions were clipped and cold, like two hostile business partners forced to share a workspace. He was infuriatingly polite, which was somehow worse than open anger. It was a performance, a way of signaling that he was the rational one, the one in control. Jessica, meanwhile, felt like a live wire. She oscillated between heart-wrenching sorrow and a furious, empowering anger. One moment she'd be weeping over a photograph from their wedding, and the next she'd be mentally cataloguing every asset for the impending divorce. She called a lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Brenda, who gave her some blunt but necessary advice. Document everything Jessica Brenda had said over the phone. Don't agree to anything verbally. And for God's sake, be careful. A man like your husband, a narcissist with a public image to protect, is most dangerous when he feels his control slipping. This public meeting feels like a power play. He's setting the stage. Don't let him direct the show. Brenda's words echoed in her mind as she got ready on Saturday morning. She chose her outfit with deliberate care. Not the somber, wounded attire of a victim, but a deep emerald green dress, tailored and elegant. It was a dress David had always said was too bold for her. She did her makeup defining her eyes, adding a touch of color to her lips. It was armor. She was not going to this meeting as the broken wife. She was going as Jessica Caldwell, a woman about to reclaim her life. The Gilded Spoon was the perfect setting for David's brand of psychological warfare. It was a chic, sun-drenched brunch spot in the Gold Coast, known for its eye-wateringly expensive menu and its clientele of socialites and power brokers. It was a place built on appearances, where people came to see and be seen. Whispers were the currency, and a public scene was social suicide. By choosing this location, David was ensuring she would be on her best behavior, too mortified to cause a scene. He was stripping her of her power before she even walked through the door. When she arrived, David was already there, seated at a prominent table in the center of the room. He stood up as she approached, a small, practiced smile on his face, as if they were any other couple meeting for a weekend meal. "Jessica, you look striking," he said, his eyes giving her a quick, appraising scan. It wasn't a compliment. It was an assessment of his opponent. "Let's just get this over with, David," she said, her voice low as she sat down. The air between them crackled with unspoken animosity. A waiter approached, but David waved him away. "We'll wait a few minutes before we order," he said smoothly, then turned his attention back to Jessica. "Look, I know you're angry, but I want us to handle this with dignity. There are assets to discuss the house. We have a lot to untangle." He spoke in calm, measured tones, laying out the logistics of their separation as if he were outlining a corporate merger. He talked about fairness and mutual respect, a sickening irony that made Jessica's stomach churn. She noticed he kept glancing towards the entrance, a subtle, almost imperceptible tick. He was waiting for something. Or someone. "What is this, David?" she finally asked, cutting through his monologue. "Why do I feel like I'm at a business negotiation? Where is the man who cried on our wedding day? Where is the man who held my hand for 12 hours when my father was in the hospital? Did you ever exist?" A flicker of something annoyance, guilt, crossed his face before being replaced by his mask of cool detachment. "People change, Jess. We grew apart. It happens. We didn't grow apart." She shot back, her voice rising slightly. "You systematically lied to me while you built a separate life with a 26-year-old from your office." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Keep your voice down. You wanted to talk, so let's talk. I am prepared to be very generous in the settlement. More than generous. But only if this is handled cleanly without any drama." It was a threat cloaked in the language of a transaction. "Behave or I will ruin you financially." And then she saw it. His gaze flicked towards the door again, and this time a small smile touched his lips. Jessica turned her head, following his line of sight. Walking towards their table was Kimberly Jennings. She was dressed in a tight white dress that left little to the imagination. Her blonde hair was perfect, her makeup flawless. She moved with the predatory confidence of a woman who knew she had won. Her eyes were locked on Jessica, and her smile was pure, unadulterated triumph. Jessica's blood ran cold. This wasn't a discussion. This wasn't a negotiation. This was an ambush. David hadn't brought her here to talk. He'd brought her here to be replaced, to be shown her successor, to be humiliated into submission in a room full of the city's elite. Brenda's words rang in her ears. "He's setting the stage. Don't let him direct the show." But as Kimberly pulled up a chair uninvited and sat down at their table, a sickening wave of dread washed over Jessica. She had walked right into the middle of the stage, and the curtains were just beginning to rise on her personal horror show. The moment Kimberly Jennings sat down, the air at the table turned thick and suffocating. The ambient chatter of the gilded spoon, the clinking of champagne flutes, and silver cutlery all seemed to fade into a dull, distant roar. Jessica's world had shrunk to the 3 feet of space occupied by her husband, his mistress, and herself. Kimberly didn't even glance at David. Her entire focus, sharp and malicious, was on Jessica. She placed her designer handbag on the table with a soft thud, a territorial gesture. So Kimberly began her voice, a little too loud, drawing the attention of the adjacent tables. "You must be Jessica. David's told me so much about you." The condescension was palpable. Jessica felt a flush of heat creep up her neck. She looked at David, expecting him to say something, to intervene, to manage the situation he had so clearly orchestrated. He just sat there, a passive observer, a faint, unreadable expression on his face. He was enjoying this. He was watching to see what she would do. Jessica took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. She would not give them the satisfaction of a hysterical scene. She turned her gaze to Kimberly, her eyes as cold as she could make them. "And you must be the junior associate who thinks sleeping with her boss is a viable career strategy. He's told me absolutely nothing about you." A flicker of surprise crossed Kimberly's face before her triumphant smirk returned harder this time. "Oh, he's told me plenty. He told me how you two haven't really connected in years, how you let yourself go, how you're more like a business manager than a wife." Each word was a poisoned dart aimed with precision. They were David's words, Jessica knew, twisted and weaponized by this younger woman. These were the private, insidious criticisms he'd used to undermine her confidence for years now being broadcast in public. "What do you want, Kimberly Jessica?" asked her voice tight. "What I want what I already have," she said, her voice dripping with venom. She lifted her left hand and placed it on the table, displaying a delicate diamond ring on her fourth finger. It wasn't an engagement ring, but it was significant, a clear symbol. I want David, and he wants me. We're in love. He's just too decent to throw you out on the street without a conversation. He felt he owed you that. The word decent hung in the air, a grotesque perversion of the truth. Jessica glanced at the ring, then at David's impassive face. He wouldn't even meet her eyes. He was a coward hiding behind his mistress. "Is that what this is, David?" Jessica said, her voice dangerously quiet. "You brought me here so your girlfriend could do your dirty work for you." David finally spoke, his tone placating. "Now, Jess, let's not be dramatic. Kimberly is just being honest. We all need to be honest if we're going to move forward." "Move forward," Jessica's laugh was a sharp, bitter sound. "You mean after you two finish demolishing my life? What's the next step? Do you want me to pack your bags for you?" Kimberly leaned in her voice, dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was somehow more piercing than a shout. "Actually, I've already done that. His things are at my place, the apartment he pays for. You know, the one with the great view of the city. He says the view from your house in the suburbs is just so dull, so domestic. The humiliation was a physical force pressing down on her, stealing the air from her lungs. People at the surrounding tables were now openly staring their brunch, forgotten. They were witnessing a blood sport, and she was the prey. This was David's plan all along, to break her spirit so thoroughly that she would accept whatever scraps he threw her way in the divorce. She would be too ashamed to fight, too broken to demand what she was owed. She would just disappear quietly. She felt the sting of tears behind her eyes and fought them back with every ounce of her will. She would not cry. She would not give them that victory. She rose to her feet, her hands trembling. "I'm done," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "I'm not sitting here for this." But as she turned to leave, Kimberly's voice, sharp and cruel, cut through the air, stopping her cold. "Running away, is that what you always do? No wonder he got so bored. He needs a woman who fights for what she wants, not some faded housewife who gave up on her life years ago." Jessica froze her back to the table. The insult hit its mark, striking at the very heart of her deepest insecurity, the sacrifice of her career, the life she had given up for him. She slowly turned back her eyes, locking with Kimberly's. The younger woman's face was a mask of smug certainty. She believed she held all the cards. She had the man, the apartment, the future, and in that moment, in the center of that hushed and watching restaurant, it certainly looked like she did. Jessica felt utterly and completely alone, caught in the crossfire of a battle she didn't even know she was supposed to be fighting. The ambush was complete. The restaurant was now unnervingly quiet. The ambient noise had ceased, replaced by a focused, predatory silence. Every diner in the Gilded Spoon had become an audience member for Jessica's public crucifixion. Her legs felt weak, but she refused to sit back down. She stood there, trapped in the spotlight of dozens of prying eyes. Kimberly, sensing she had Jessica on the ropes, decided to press her advantage to go for the kill. She stood up as well, closing the distance between them, creating a direct confrontational tableau for the entire room to see. "You know, I almost feel sorry for you," Kimberly said, her voice laced with false pity. She gestured around the opulent room. "You think all of this, the big house, the fancy restaurants, makes you his partner. But you're just the curator of his museum. I'm his future. We're building something real. She then launched into a brutal, detailed monologue designed to inflict maximum pain. She spoke of intimate moments with David, shared jokes, future plans. She mentioned the vacation they had already booked to Santorini, a trip Jessica had been dreaming of for a decade, a binder full of ideas for it sitting in her home office. David and I connect on an intellectual level you just can't understand. Kimberly continued, her voice rising with righteous fervor. We talk about his work, his ambitions. He says talking to you is like reading a day-old newspaper. You just don't get the pressure he's under. Jessica stared at David, who was now studiously examining a water glass, refusing to engage. His silence was his complicity. He was sanctioning this. He was allowing this woman to systematically tear down 15 years of their life, every shared memory, every sacrifice Jessica had made, and repaint it as a loveless, boring sham. Kimberly wasn't done. She turned her attack to Jessica's appearance. "He bought me this dress last week," she said, running a hand down her hip. "He said he loves how I'm not afraid to show my figure. He said it's refreshing to be with a woman who still takes pride in herself." The implication was clear and hideous. Every late night, Jessica had stayed up balancing their accounts. Every weekend, she'd spent planning a corporate dinner instead of going to the gym. Every worry line on her face, from managing their complex lives, all of it was being used as evidence of her failure, as a woman, as a wife. The ultimate blow came when Kimberly reached into her purse and pulled out a small velvet jewelry box. She snapped it open. Inside was a pair of stunning sapphire earrings, the exact ones Jessica had pointed out in a Tiffany's window on their anniversary last month. David had claimed they couldn't afford them, that they needed to be more frugal. "He gave me these last night," Kimberly said, her voice soft and triumphant. "He said blue is the color of new beginnings, our new beginning." That was it. The final unbearable piece of cruelty. It wasn't just about infidelity anymore. It was about a deep, calculated contempt. He hadn't just cheated. He had actively taken her dreams, her desires, and given them to someone else. He had made a mockery of her very identity. A single tear finally escaped and traced a hot path down Jessica's cheek. She wiped it away angrily. The whispers around the room grew louder. She could feel the judgment, the pity, the morbid curiosity of the onlookers. She was a spectacle, the crazy older wife being publicly replaced by the newer model. It was a humiliating, misogynistic cliché, and she was its unwilling star. "Are you satisfied?" Jessica's voice was a raw, broken whisper directed at David. "Is this what you wanted? Is my humiliation complete?" David finally looked up, a pained expression on his face that was so false, so theatrical it was obscene. "Jess, I told you I didn't want a scene. You're the one getting emotional. Kimberly is just trying to be honest about the reality of the situation." The sheer audacity of his gaslighting of him, trying to frame her as the hysterical one in a situation he had engineered, was breathtaking. He was going to sit there and let this happen, then blame her for her own pain. Jessica felt a profound sense of despair wash over her. She was outmaneuvered, outmatched, and utterly alone. Kimberly was smirking. David was playing the victim, and the world was watching her fall apart. There was no escape. She had lost. The life she knew was over, and it was ending right here in a cacophony of whispers and the smug smile of her husband's mistress. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, but only a choked sob came out. The humiliation was absolute. Just as Jessica's composure was about to shatter completely, a new voice sliced through the charged atmosphere of the restaurant. It was calm, clear, and carried an undeniable weight of authority. "I believe the young lady is mistaken." Every head, including Jessica's, David's, and Kimberly's, turned towards the source. A woman was rising from a secluded corner booth. She was perhaps in her late 60s, with impeccably styled silver hair and eyes that were a startlingly sharp shade of blue. She was dressed in a simple but exquisitely tailored navy blue pantsuit. There was nothing flashy about her. Yet, she commanded the room's attention more effectively than Kimberly's loud theatrics ever could. She moved with a quiet grace, her gaze fixed not on Jessica or Kimberly, but directly on David. As she approached their table, a wave of recognition, followed by pure, undiluted panic, washed over David's face. His carefully constructed mask of detached calm dissolved, replaced by a ghastly, pale shock. He looked like he had seen a ghost. "Helen," he stammered, his voice barely audible. What are you doing here?" The woman, Helen, stopped beside their table. She gave Kimberly a brief, dismissive glance, as if she were a mildly interesting piece of furniture, before her piercing eyes landed back on David. "I was having a quiet lunch." "David," she said, her voice even and dangerously pleasant, "until your negotiation became rather loud. It's been a long time. You haven't aged well. The dishonesty seems to be settling in your features." Kimberly, puffed up with arrogance and incensed at being ignored, stepped forward. "Excuse me, but this is a private conversation." "Who are you?" Helen finally turned her full attention to Kimberly. She didn't look angry. She looked bored, like a biologist examining a common, uninteresting specimen. "My name is Helen Cartwright," she said simply. "And you, my dear, are a cliché. A rather sad one at that." The name Helen Cartwright seemed to suck the remaining air out of the room. To Jessica, the name meant nothing, but she saw the flicker of recognition and fear in the eyes of several onlookers at nearby tables, older men in expensive suits who suddenly looked very uncomfortable. And David looked like he was about to be physically ill. "Now, David," Helen continued, her tone shifting from dismissive to surgical, "I find myself curious. You used to have better taste, a bit more subtlety. This is just vulgar. Staging a public execution of your wife, it's profoundly disappointing." David scrambled to his feet, trying to regain some semblance of control. "Helen, this is a private family matter. With all due respect, it's none of your business." Helen let out a soft, dry laugh that held no humor. "Oh, but that's where you're wrong. When you built your entire career on a foundation of theft and deceit, your business becomes my business, specifically when what you stole was mine." Jessica stared at this woman, Helen Cartwright, completely bewildered. Theft career. What did this have to do with the affair? Kimberly, however, saw her victory slipping away and tried to reclaim the narrative. "He's not a thief. David is a brilliant man, a partner at Stratton & Cole. He's one of the most respected consultants in the city." Helen's sharp blue eyes snapped back to Kimberly, and this time there was a flicker of something that looked almost like pity. "My poor child. You have no idea who you've tied yourself to, do you? You think you're his queen, but you're just another pawn, a disposable one." She then turned back to David, who was now sweating visibly. The entire dynamic had shifted. David and Kimberly were no longer the predators. They were cornered. The audience was no longer watching Jessica. They were all captivated by this elegant, formidable woman who had appeared from nowhere. Helen Cartwright looked from David's terrified face to Jessica's stunned one. She gave Jessica a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of alliance. It was the first moment of solidarity Jessica had felt all day. "Sit down, Jessica," Helen said, her voice softening slightly. "I believe there are a few things you and the rest of this room need to hear about the real David Caldwell. The witness had taken the stand. The trial was about to begin, but the man in the dock was no longer Jessica. It was her husband. Helen Cartwright remained standing, a figure of immense composure and power. The restaurant was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. David stood frozen, his face a mask of primal fear. Kimberly looked confused and angry, her carefully planned victory scene hijacked by an unknown player. "Let me tell you all a story," Helen began, her voice resonating with clarity. She wasn't shouting, but her words commanded the attention of every person in the room. "About 20 years ago, I was a senior partner at a boutique consulting firm. I took a chance on a young man fresh out of business school. He was ambitious, charming, and hungry. He reminded me of myself at that age. His name was David Caldwell." She paused, letting the information settle. She looked directly at David. "I mentored you. I opened doors for you. I brought you into my most important project, a revolutionary logistics and supply chain model I'd been developing for years. I called it Project Nightingale. It was my life's work." Jessica watched David, who seemed to shrink under Helen's gaze. His hands were trembling. Project Nightingale was set to redefine the industry. Helen continued, her voice hardening. And David knew it. He knew every detail, every algorithm, every projection. And one weekend, while I was away visiting my dying sister, he went into the office, copied every file from my server, and resigned via email on Monday morning. 2 months later, Stratton and Cole announced their groundbreaking new Cygnus protocol, which miraculously bore a stunning resemblance to my work. It was the protocol that made their firm a global leader. It was the protocol that made David Caldwell a partner. He didn't just steal my project, he stole my legacy. Gasps rippled through the room. A man at a nearby table, a well-known CEO, slowly lowered his coffee cup, his eyes wide. "Why didn't you do anything?" someone whispered from another table. Helen's gaze swept the room. "Oh, I tried." But he was clever. He had changed just enough of the terminology, tweaked a few variables, and cloaked it in corporate jargon. My firm was small. Stratton and Cole had an army of lawyers. They buried me in litigation until I could no longer afford to fight. He knew I was emotionally and financially drained from my sister's illness. He timed his betrayal perfectly. It was a vicious, brilliant, and sociopathic move, the kind that in some circles is rewarded. She then turned her piercing stare back to David. "But you made one mistake, David. You were arrogant. You thought I would just fade away. But I'm a patient woman. And technology has improved remarkably in 20 years. A few months ago, I hired a digital forensic team to analyze my original time-stamped server backups from 2 decades ago. The ones I kept on a dusty hard drive in my study. The metadata is irrefutable. It proves line by line that your entire career is built on a lie." David finally found his voice, a desperate, strangled squeak. That's slander. You can't prove any of that." Helen smiled, a chilling, razor-thin line. "Can't I? I had a very productive meeting yesterday with the entire executive board of Stratton and Cole, and another fascinating chat with a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist from the Wall Street Journal who finds the story of a corporate titan's fraudulent origins quite compelling. The article, I believe, goes live on Monday." The color drained completely from David's face. It was over. His career, his reputation, his entire fabricated identity, all of it was vaporized in an instant. But Helen wasn't finished. She turned her cool, analytical gaze to Kimberly, who was now looking at David with dawning horror, the pieces clicking together in her mind. "And you," Helen said, her voice softening with a deadly kind of pity. "Let me guess. He told you that you were different, that you understood him in a way his wife never could. He promised you a future, a partnership, a life of glamour. He probably gave you a little ring or some expensive earrings as a down payment on that future. She gestured toward the sapphire earrings Kimberly had flaunted so proudly. He used the same lines on the junior partner he had an affair with 5 years ago. I know because her father is a friend of mine. David ruined her career at the firm when she threatened to expose him. He uses women like you as leverage, as ego boosts, and then he discards you when you are no longer convenient. You weren't winning a man, my dear. You were applying for a temporary position with very poor long-term benefits. Kimberly stared at the earrings as if they were venomous snakes. The triumphant smirk was gone, replaced by a look of utter devastation and humiliation. She wasn't a victor. She was just the latest fool in a long line of them. She looked at David, her eyes filled with betrayal and disgust, then grabbed her purse and fled the restaurant without a word. Now only David and Jessica were left at the table, with Helen Cartwright standing over them like a figure of judgment. David sank into his chair, a broken man. He looked at Jessica, his eyes pleading for the first time in years. "Jess," he began. But Helen cut him off. "Don't," she said, her voice, a final, sharp command. "You don't get to ask for her sympathy. Not now." She then looked at Jessica, and her expression was one of profound, shared understanding. Two women from two different generations, wronged by the same man. "He has nothing left to offer you, Jessica," Helen said gently. "No money, no reputation. The man you married ceased to exist a long time ago. What you do now is up to you." With that, Helen Cartwright gave a final decisive nod. She walked to the front of the restaurant, paid her bill in cash, and left, disappearing as quietly as she had appeared. She had not only stood up for Jessica, she had dismantled the very foundations of David's world with nothing but the truth. The public crucifixion was over, but the man left bleeding on the cross was David Caldwell. The silence that followed Helen Cartwright's departure was deafening. The entire restaurant seemed to be holding its breath. David sat slumped in his chair, a hollowed-out shell of the powerful man he had been just minutes before. The whispers started again, but now they were not directed at Jessica. They were aimed at the disgraced man whose life had just been publicly detonated. Jessica looked at him, at the man she had loved, the man she had built a life with, and felt nothing. The anger was gone. The hurt was gone. All that remained was a vast, empty pity. He was pathetic. His power had always been an illusion, a costume woven from stolen ideas and propped up by lies. Without it, he was just a small, frightened man. Slowly, deliberately, she picked up her purse. She stood up, her posture straight, her head held high. She didn't say a word to him. There was nothing left to say. She looked at him one last time, not as a wife, but as a stranger. Then she turned and walked away. The walk out of the Gilded Spoon was the longest of her life, but unlike her walk in this one, was not a walk of shame. She could feel the eyes of the other patrons on her, but the stares were different now. They were filled with awe, with respect, with sympathy. As she passed the front door, the manager, a man who had looked at her with pity just moments before, rushed to open it for her. His expression one of profound apology. Stepping out onto the sunlit Chicago street felt like taking her first breath of clean air after being trapped underground. The shock was beginning to wear off, replaced by a strange, exhilarating sense of lightness. The weight of David's deceptions, the burden of his emotional abuse. The gilded cage she hadn't even realized she was trapped in it had all been lifted. She didn't go home. She couldn't bear the thought of that house with its cold modern lines and its ghost-filled rooms. Instead, she walked to a nearby park, found an empty bench, and sat down. She watched children play on the swings, she watched couples stroll by, hand in hand, and she let the tears come. But these were not tears of humiliation or heartbreak. They were tears of grief for the 15 years she had lost, and tears of release for the future that was now terrifyingly and wonderfully a blank slate. The next few weeks were a blur of lawyers, paperwork, and packing boxes. David, as Helen had predicted, was ruined. The Wall Street Journal article was a devastating, meticulously researched exposé that ended his career and made him a pariah in the business community. He tried to fight the divorce to cling to their assets, but he had no leverage. Brenda, her lawyer, was ruthless. Jessica got the house a significant portion of their liquid assets and her freedom. She put the house on the market immediately. She wanted no reminders. One rainy afternoon, while sorting through old boxes in the attic, she found her old set of professional cameras, lenses, and tripods sleeping in their custom-fitted cases. She opened one, her fingers tracing the cool metal of the camera body. She lifted it to her eye, the weight of it familiar and comforting in her hands. A part of her she thought was long dead flickered back to life. A month later, a small handwritten card arrived in her new, much smaller apartment. The cardstock was thick and expensive. The note was brief. "Jessica, I hope you are finding your new beginning. I've heard you've taken up your photography again. The world needs more people who know how to capture the truth. If you ever find yourself in need of an ally or just a cup of coffee, you have my number. Yours, Helen Cartwright." Jessica smiled a genuine, unburdened smile. She had sold the architectural masterpiece and was now living in a loft with brilliant natural light. Her days were filled not with managing a social calendar, but with rediscovering the city through her lens, finding beauty in the stark lines of bridges and the hidden geometry of alleyways. She was poor in a way she hadn't been in years, but she felt richer than she ever had in her life. Her humiliation in the Gilded Spoon had felt like an ending, but she realized now that it wasn't. It was a violent, painful, and necessary demolition. It was the razing of a condemned structure to make way for something new, something real, something that was entirely her own. She picked up her camera, looked out at the city skyline, and knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that she was finally ready to start building. Jessica's story is a powerful reminder that our lowest moments do not have to define us. What began as a cruel and calculated plan to humiliate her became the catalyst for her liberation. It shows us that strength isn't just about enduring pain, but about having the courage to walk away from a life that is no longer yours and build a new one from the ground up. It's also a story about the unexpected angels and allies we find in our darkest hours, strangers who see our struggle and choose to stand up for what is right. Helen Cartwright's intervention wasn't just about revenge. It was an act of justice that gave Jessica the chance to reclaim her own narrative. If this story of resilience, justice, and empowerment resonated with you, please take a moment to click that like button. Share it with someone who might need a reminder of their own inner strength. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that inspire and remind us of the incredible power of the human spirit. Thank you for listening.